Hi, everyone. Welcome to my talk on accessibility in games, the right thing to do. This is a topic that means quite a lot to me, and I'm hoping to share some of that with you. So thank you very much for attending, and let's just hop right into it. So I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name's Sean Rajab. I use the he and him pronouns. I'm the Accessibility QA lead at WB Games Montreal. I have 9 years experience working in video games, and I have about 27 years experience playing video games. I've been researching accessibility in games for about 3 years now, and I've been working full-time on the subject for about a year. A little bit of housekeeping to cover before I get started. There's choice of language that I use in here between disability and impairment. I've met groups that prefer one term over the other, and then vice versa. If I'm using a term that is offensive to you, please know that my choice of language is coming from a place of respect. And I'll be using the two terms interchangeably. Same goes for the identity first versus person first language. For example, blind person versus person who is blind. I'll be using them interchangeably as well. You're probably going to see a lot of the A11Y abbreviation on screen. That is a short-term form for accessibility. It's A, 11 letters, and then the letter Y, and it reads out as ally, so it's kind of cool, so kind of run with it. And also, I'm kind of breaking a rule about PowerPoint. I'm using full sentences on there. That is intended in case people can't hear me correctly, that you kind of have almost captions of the presentation. Last and not least, the accessibility lab is going to be set up behind you. If there's noise or things that might come to distract you, just roll with it. You're going to be able to experience that at the end of the presentation. All right, so what am I going to be talking about today? I'm going to talk about my journey into accessibility in games, my personal story. I'm going to talk what is accessibility in games, give you a better idea of what the subject matter is. Who should own accessibility in games? Within a studio or within a project, whose responsibility should it be for accessibility? And then I'm going to follow up with how to make your games accessible, some tips and tricks on some of the most common points that are discussed in the community. And then we're going to have an opportunity to introduce the Accessibility Awareness Lab. So from the left, my story starts off with a bit of a rant. As I was creating this talk, I bought a game at launch, and I was excited to play it. I was hyped for about 2 years for it. I was super excited to play. My girlfriend was super excited to watch me play, to experience the story. And then we saw the text size when we booted it, and my immediate reaction was, oh no. So here we have a screen of the map and information screen within the game. You may notice that it might be quite difficult in order to read the objective text on the screen. That's because it's using a light blue on another blue in a very small size. It just made it very difficult for even me to kind of read and understand the content on there. So the game was illegible from the couch. I had to take a chair, bring it up closer to the TV in order to actually see, read, and play the game. And this kind of ruined the shared experience that we were hoping to have between me and my girlfriend. And I have another screenshot on screen of within the personal quarters within the game. And you may not see it there, but there is text on there, light blue on white. So yeah, just a little bit example of how relevant accessibility, even to someone who is considered fully abled, can experience in a game. So game creators put their heart and soul into the games that they make. You want to create adventures, you want stories, experiences, and you want to share that with the world. Now imagine you have a fan that is a big fan of your work, loves your stuff, comes up to you and says, hey, great stuff, but your latest game, I can't play it. And this is where I'm hoping to change your mindset a little bit. If you've heard about accessibility, it might have been described to you as it's about changing your game to allow people with disabilities to play. And I want to shape that into a new framework saying it's about designing games that avoids excluding people. So my personal story, I was working at WB Games since January 2013. While I was there, I worked on 2 titles. There's Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor and Middle-earth: Shadow of War. I was playing the Pokemon trading card game at a local card and board game shop. I happened to be wearing a hoodie that was promoting the game that I was working on at the time, Shadow of War. I had a friend who recognized it. He was like, "Oh yeah, I tried to play the prequel, Shadow of Mordor." I'm like, "Cool, I worked on that too. What'd you think of it?" He told me that he couldn't get past the tutorial. And that's because in the tutorial, there's a requirement where you have to aim the bow with the left trigger and then fire an arrow with the right trigger. And time stops. It won't progress unless you fire that first arrow. Now, my friend happens to have cerebral palsy, and he's unable to pull both triggers simultaneously. So that was a hard blocker for him. So this is what got me thinking about accessibility in games. It was my introduction. I decided that I wanted to pursue it. I wasn't sure what it was. And it's like, is it a thing? Is it considered? And at the time, I was dealing with depression, and games were my escape. Games were my way of coping. And I realized that with situations like this, there must be gamers out there in the world that wants to use games for the same purpose, but they can't. So I wondered, all right, let's see what we can do. Luckily, my circumstances at work allowed me to start with a small team. We became the dedicated accessibility team at WB Games, and as our work progressed, we gained a lot more recognition, and our responsibilities grew. And some of the initiatives that we put out there were started increasing impact. We created a public-facing accessibility channel, an email that people can contact if they have any accessibility concerns, able@wbgames.com. We established working relationships with various accessibility consultants, some of which I'll list at the end of this presentation in case you're looking for resources. We created guidelines that we shared with our development partners in order to avoid unintentional accessibility barriers. And now, as evidenced by me being here on stage, we're working to push accessibility information out into the industry to make the gaming world more inclusive. As our work team became more experienced and we got our hands on more titles and we had more and more time to work with different developers, the impact on the actual games that we published were significant. They started becoming more and more recognized for the features for accessibility. For example, in Mortal Kombat 11, there's a feature that reads out the menu options, and now as of I'm not sure when the patch was, but it's now on by default, which allows someone who can't see the menu to navigate it without relying on sighted assistance. The Lego Movie 2 video game features a colorblind mode. As you can imagine with Lego games, there's a lot of colors, there's a lot of puzzles that you're going to have to solve with different bricks. And the colorblind mode allows someone who has color blindness, whichever variation of it, to progress. It writes out the name of the color on your inventory, and if you're in a specific situation where you have to paint something a specific color, you can use any color and it'll allow you to progress. Golf Clash is a popular mobile title. It is now fully supporting screen readers built in to both Android and iOS. And one of the things that I'm a little bit proud of is in Mortal Kombat 11, there are features that allows a blind player and a deaf player to communicate with each other online, and they'll be able to understand each other. So with all that experience and stories and all that, it's time to share some of the stuff that me and my team learn with you. And please, questions will be at the end. And I would please just take in everything. Steal what you can. So what is accessibility in games? The typical definition that I've been given was that it's about removing barriers to allow players with disabilities to play your game. If you've been introduced to the subject before, maybe you've heard this definition. And I want to transition that definition into what I call the logical definition. It's about using clever design to allow all players to play your game. I want to take the focus away from just being players with disabilities, and I don't want it to sound about changing. It's about building it accessible from the ground up. There's a popular story in the U.S. Air Force about fighter pilots. They were redesigning the cockpits, and they decided to take hundreds of fighter pilots, take their measurements of their arms, their legs, chest, height, weight, and they took a large sample size. Like, I think they started with 400, and then they eventually went to the thousands to design the cockpit for the average pilot. What happened when they started putting that into effect were the planes started just crashing during tests or mid-combat, and is it mechanical failure? And they decided, it must be pilot error. What happened was no pilot fit the exact average measurement. There was nobody that was able to, has the exact arm length or leg length, height that the cockpit was built for. It wasn't built to be adjustable. It was built for the average pilot. And there's a lovely quote on screen. Any system designed around the average person is doomed to fail. If my voice starts failing, I apologize. Montreal winter, got hit with a really bad cold. That's why I'm sipping water. I'm still recovering, so thank you. So here's some fun facts. I see there's some friends from Ubisoft, so I'm stealing some of your stats that were publicized. In Assassin's Creed Odyssey, subtitles are on by default. 95% of the player base kept them on. And let's keep in mind that subtitles are essentially an accessibility feature for the hearing impaired. Far Cry New Dawn, subtitles, again, on by default. 97% kept them on. And some stats from one of our titles, Mortal Kombat 11, that same read menu option that I described earlier, since it was on by default, 98.8% of the player base kept them on. So in regards to making something for the average person, does that qualify as average? Do people need those features? Or if they're built into it in a graceful way, the whole player base will just run with it because it just seems like it fits with it. Do you use accessibility features? Have you ever tweaked your graphic settings when you're playing a game? Have you ever modified some of your controls? When you're on transit and you're holding on to a pole on the bus or on the subway, do you play one-handed on your phone? Do you have a preference between rotating mini maps or fixed? And do you adjust the brightness on your TV on different parts of the day, or maybe on your phone to adjust the lighting? These are all accessibility settings, and these benefit essentially all of us in different situations. Situational disability is a thing. If you have a child that is sleeping in the next room and you don't want to wake them up, you're probably going to put the volume super low, and maybe they'll use the subtitles to understand. So this is essentially the curb cut effect. The curb cut effect, it describes the slopes that you see on sidewalks, where the sidewalk will level off to the street level. These were essentially designed for World War II veterans in the U.S. for wheelchairs. The fun thing about it is that a lot of other people were able to benefit from it. So think of parents with strollers, bicycle riders, if someone's rollerblading, or if you're delivering a trolley full of packages or equipment. I was just told before, the fashion industry, if they have racks full of clothing, you use those ramps. It's an accessibility feature, but it helps everyone in some sense. So solving accessibility features benefits everyone, not just impaired users. And accessibility gets you noticed. If you're introducing a accessibility feature, or if your game gets reviewed by an accessibility review group and you get praise like Gears of War 5 did, it gets you noticed, and that justifies the cost that may be put into making a game accessible. Something to consider is like, hey, this, in some ways, if you got a hit, it's accessible, it's going to pay for itself. For example, on screen, I have 3 different headlines that were published on different video game news sites. There's one from Destiny 1, where the colorblind mode being introduced made a headline. Just by having that feature in there, it news sources just ran with it. Gears of War 5 was recently praised for having a perfect rating from canIplayThat.com for audio accessibility. And also for you mobile developers, the Google Play Store has a blind-friendly filter that helps your game get noticed in that saturated marketplace if it is made accessible. So if you have chat in your game, you need to know about the CVAA. The CVAA is the 21st century video and audio accessibility app. The waiver for this expired on January 1st this year. This thing's been in effect for telecommunications since 2010. Video games, as of January 1st, now it started being a focal point. The short form of it is that all titles with advanced communication services need to be accessible. And the term accessible, detailed in the legislation, is locatable, identifiable, and operable to users with one or more disability types. So there's a legal thing to actually consider if you're publishing in the States. So let's say you don't care about the exposure, you don't have a form of advanced communication services, and you're like, do I need to care about accessibility? If you're a little bit of the, I don't want to say selfish, but I'll use the word selfish type, think about this. I have on quote a screen from David Huntley, who is the Senior Executive Vice President and Chief Compliance Officer at AT&T. And here's the quote that he says. I would say that if you just keep living long enough, you too will have an accessibility issue. It's not about them or they, it's about us. Now, I don't know about you, but as I grow older, when I get retired, I want to play games. If my vision starts failing or I start having difficulty using my hands on a controller, I still want to be able to play games. So accessibility in games benefits all of us in the long run. All right, we get it. Accessibility is important. So whose job is it? Who should own accessibility games is it's something that was a growing pain a little bit on our team side, and here's my observations that I want to share with you. In AAA production, the responsibilities needs to be clearly defined. Otherwise, everybody's going to assume, UI's got it, audio's got it, gameplay's got it. Whose job is it? Who's in charge of subtitles? Who's in charge of evaluating if a screen is so busy that sensory overload will cause someone to be unable to play? Where is it best? Where's the most efficient place to put accessibility training for the investment? So I have on screen a visual separating, very much simplifying game development into three groups: publishing, development, and testing and user research. And each of these groups has a representative of a source that is giving a different comment in regards to accessibility in their title. So let's say you put the accessibility training in testing and user research. That's the group that is trained in accessibility. They know how to identify it. They will call out if something is inaccessible, or whether it's from the community or from testing. And by not training the other groups, you'll have the questions of how much is it going to cost from the publishing side. How do you make a title on mobile screen reader compatible? You're lacking the training in that sense. Contrary, if you put that training in development, all right, we have accessibility features and we want to put it in, again, how much is it going to cost? And then you'll have a user research team and a testing team that won't be able to tell you if something is not working correctly. Like, it looks fine, I guess. I mean, I could see the colors. So that's a little bit of a risk point there. And if you have it just in the publishing side, all right, cool, we got to consider accessibility. Same problems at the other ends. You'll have a group that won't have the knowledge to really implement the accessibility feature or know what to be aware of, and then your testing and user research team won't be able to call out when it starts, not having the impact you're hoping for. So instead, it would be kind of difficult to train everybody in a studio for accessibility, but have a small amount or an individual in each group, in each tier. And from them being trained, they will influence the rest of the group by proxy, and you'll have someone that can assist in passing along the accessibility development. So you're going to have a situation where publishing is going to be like, hey, we need to think about the CVAA and accessibility features. Developers are going to be like, cool, I've got ideas on how to do this, I'm ready. And then your QA and your user research will be like, all right, we'll let you know if there's any problems whatsoever. And this is the concept of accessibility champions. People who are knowledgeable in accessibility and care to influence the team and to really push it forward. So let's say you want to be an accessibility champion. Now is when I'm going to get into the meat of how to make your games accessible. Just some tips, pointers. If you want to take notes, absolutely encourage it. So for accessibility in games, the most talked about, and when I say talked about, I'm going to say complained about aspects, is about text size, such as my example at the beginning of the presentation, input remapping, color blindness, and subtitles. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about each one, what to look for, and how to make sure it's a little bit more accessible. So games are typically developed on a PC monitor that's about 2 feet away. But on console, games are played on a TV that's about 10 or so feet away, or on a smaller TV, or maybe there's glare. Not everybody's got a 65-inch, 4K, HDR, 120 hertz with 7.1.4 Dolby Atmos. Like, think about a realistic scenario. A small TV, maybe across a dorm room. Your font should be readable in those situations as well. Like, I have on screen an image I found on YouTube from someone that was presenting their gaming setup and how awesome it is. And in the images on screen, it shows a TV in a living room, and I would say like it's about 10 feet away from it. And it also shows the viewpoint of someone that is sitting on the couch in there. And you can notice that TV's kind of far. It's cool, it's nice, it looks good, but you're got to be able to make out the small details on that screen. How far is your TV set up at home? So in providing a readable text size, research in the disabled community indicates that on a 1080p display for subtitles, 46 pixel size. I'm going to have an image on the next slide that kind of shows roughly what that looks like on a screen. And for your UI text, at least 28 pixels on a 1080p display. And color contrast is important. I have a little comparison on screen that has a dark on dark text, and then compared to a white on dark text, so you can see color contrast. It's something to consider. So, not the best quality image. I apologize for that, but it just indicates what do these sizes look like if you're looking at a screen. So 1080p, like I said, UI, you go for 28 pixel size, and for subtitle text size, you go for 46 pixels. All right, input remapping, control setups. There's 2 common ways that this is handled. There's controller presets. Usually this allows someone to quickly swap between different modes, swapping the sticks, or having the triggers being on the face buttons instead. Or you have full list configurations, and this is where you remap everything individually for each action. So in the terms of presets, I have on screen an example from Gears of War 4. It allows users to quickly swap to a style that suits them. And when you're using presets as your way of remapping controls, think about the following. L3 and R3, clicking the sticks, most inaccessible input on the controller. It's difficult. Second most being the triggers, as I explained in my example story from the beginning of the presentation. If you can allow the functions on those inputs to be remapped anywhere else, let it happen. A lot of sticks to be swapped for camera and movement. And if your game has controls that could accommodate it, consider having a one-handed mode where someone can use either side of the controller. Uncharted, the Uncharted series is great at this because they have the camera following the character, auto aim assist, a whole bunch of features that allow someone to play through it one-handed if they needed. And while we're on the subject of presets, this is actually a little bit of a personal vendetta because I have a friend who plays games left-handed, so he didn't adapt for using the mouse on the right hand. he keeps using the mouse on the left hand. And whenever we get into a new game, like an MMO, and we want to hit server firsts, he goes, hold on, guys, I got to remap my controls. How hard would it be to implement a lefty default setting? You just flip it and then boom. And then next thing you know, if you have a problem with your save, and you don't have to remap your controls all over again. So on screen, I have an image of a keyboard that shows the usual most used keys with a WASD setup for right-handed users, and the equivalent that is used by a majority of the left-handed gaming community on the keyboard, which focuses on PL, semicolon, and apostrophe as the core keys. And you'll notice that the layout is pretty similar between the two. So full list configurations. I have on screen an example from Injustice 2, one of our titles. It allows you to remap every single function on the controller to a different button, no matter how you want. This is pretty much a standard on PC gaming for controller, for keyboard remapping. And it's great for games with non-contextual controls. If you have contextual controls, you gotta put a little more thought into it. And the great thing about this, it allows the use of alternative controller options. So if someone does not want to use a standard controller, they can use any one of these devices that I have listed on screen. Keyboard and mouse, the Xbox adaptive controller, which you'll be able to see in the accessibility lab behind you, using an arcade fight stick for titles that weren't built for an arcade fight stick, and sometimes even using a mobile device as a controller, such as the case with the Jackbox series. And yeah, you could use keyboard mouse on consoles. You can use an arcade fight stick on a console. The Xbox adaptive controller was developed for Xbox One, so yeah, you could use it. There was a story where I was speaking to someone who had a dilemma of like, okay, I want to make it more accessible for my controls, but there's not enough buttons on the controller to separate my light from my heavy attacks. And I suggested, like, can't you use a keyboard? Oh yeah. So that was a realization, and it's something to consider. There's controversy about like multiplayer games or shooters if you're using a mouse keyboard, but if you have a single player game, why not? All right, going into colorblind friendly design. Again, stealing a little bit of stuff from Ubisoft. Thank you very much for being awesome. Use symbols, use symbology, use icons. Don't just rely on color to transfer information. I have on screen from Starlink, Battle for Atlas, the different tiers for mod rarities. And the image on the left is in normal color vision, and the rarities become much more intricate. The icons become much more intricate the higher the rarity of the mod is. So you'll notice, for example, on the gray one, which is the most common, there's one little pip at the bottom. Whereas by the time you get to the orange one, which is the highest rating, you've got spikes coming out of the top, extra pips. It's extravagant, just in aesthetics. And then I have next to it an image of the same screen put through a colorblind simulation for tritanopia, which is a yellow blindness. And you can still clearly identify which one of these. Even if the colors were identical between two different icon rarities, you can discern it from the shape. If you absolutely need to use colors, the safest color combination to use is blue and orange. The reason for this is because through most of the colorblind types, save for monochromacy, the two colors can be easily distinguished from each other. Here's how it looks from the different perspectives of color blindness. I have on screen normal vision comparing blue and orange, and then the same image done through tritanopia, protanopia, and deuteranopia for color blindness. Additionally, the hue of the color makes a difference. Blue tends to be a darker color than orange, so even with monochromacy, it's a safe bet. Okay, subtitles. Most games have them. Sometimes they're not great. Subtitles is probably the most talked about or complained about thing in games. So a couple of pointers on how to get them just a little bit more right. You got to take care of font size, letterboxing. You have to identify the speaker. How many characters do you put in a line? And turn them on by default. As you saw from the stats, like if it's built well into the UI, people don't mind it. So, as I mentioned earlier, 46 pixels on a 1080p display, that's your target font size for subtitles. On screen, I have an example from one of our titles that we released back in 2015, way before the accessibility team existed. This is Batman Arkham Knight, and we're evolving our UI and subtitle processes going forward. On that screen, the text is barely readable for the subtitles. Next to it, I have a screenshot from Bertram Fiddle showing the subtitles in there, and it's very clearly contrasted, decently sized. You could actually read out. I guess I'm blocking some of the content. I apologize. But you can actually make out the words from a distance. Letterboxing and letter shadowing. This will protect your text from various backgrounds. If you have white subtitles and then you start looking at a snowy field or a bunch of clouds, you're going to lose your text. So try to include a letterbox or letter shadowing so that your text can be viewed from any background. In the example of Nier Automata, they put letterboxing on their subtitles that you can identify very clearly because there's a nice contrast that is visible there. In the case of Yakuza 6, they use profound letter shadowing so that the white of the subtitle is surrounded by black so that it will be visible no matter what color behind it. Identifying the speaker, there's multiple ways that you could do this for subtitles. In the case of Portal 2, on screen I have an example where it shows that GLaDOS is talking. It has it in text right at the beginning of the line. In Tomb Raider, the subtitles are color-coded. Initially, they introduce the speaker, they put the name, or they clearly show who is talking by you're seeing their face when the line comes up. There's a color associated to it. And then as soon as that link has been established, you could drop the text saying who the speaker is, because the color makes it recognizable of who's speaking. On screen, I have an example from Star Fox 64. By putting the image of the face of the person, the pilot who's speaking, that's an accessibility feature. It shows Peppy is there telling you how to do a barrel roll. Now, characters per line. At the max, 2 lines at a time, 40 characters per line, and try to have your line breaks at natural points of speak. So if it's a sentence, a sentence. If there's a pause, put your line break there. It makes it much more easily readable. Someone could follow along fairly quickly, and it doesn't clutter up and make it difficult to read within a short time span. In the case of the example on screen, it has 4 lines of text and characters going from one edge to the end, and it makes your eye have to travel the entire distance, and it's just a little bit overbearing to read. Compared to the example that I have on screen right now, which is from Xenoblade Chronicles 2, it shows the subtitles are there's 2 lines on the screen. There's not that many characters. There's a pause. There's a line break right after a sentence. Makes it much easier to read and follow along with it. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Accessibility Awareness Lab, which is set up behind you. This lab is an interactive experience that we wanted to share with you to open up your minds about accessibility concerns. The purpose of the lab, it's not meant to be a simulation. It's not like this is what someone with color blindness lives with. It's more to make you see how you naturally rely on different shortcuts or methods of compensation when you're restricted in some way. How do you go about managing a controller if your hands are restricted with in limited movement? Do you start using 2 hands for something you would normally use with 1? Consider the shortcuts that you make. Think about what features in a game could make those shortcuts easier to use. And yeah, please ask questions and learn something. So I'm coming up to the closing slides for my presentation. I want to thank you all for listening and wish you good luck in making a more inclusive future for video games. And there's a lot of resources on the subject if you're looking for more information. There's GamesAccessibilityGuidelines.com, which is a great resource that details out a bunch of different aspects and how to avoid it, what kind of features you want to have to avoid unintentional barriers. There's the Able Gamers charity who can get disabled players to come and play test your titles to get first-hand experience. And there's conferences. For example, there's GA Conf, so Game Accessibility Conference, the next one of which is in September 2020. And if you're looking for accessibility consultants, some of the ones that I'm familiar with, having traveled around and connecting with them at different locations, there's Ian Hamilton, who is the author of GamesAccessibilityGuidelines.com, Cherry Ray Thompson, Steve Saylor, also known as the Blind Gamer. Sightless Combat is amazing at fighting games, despite being fully blind. And there's Josh Robb of the Dagger System that can provide a full review of your title. So yeah, thank you very much. That was my presentation. If you want to contact me, my contact information is on screen, or you could come and see me afterwards. And at this point, I'll open the floor to questions. And I'm going to have to figure out how to listen into those questions. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, it was just similar on your subtitles slide when you were talking about how many characters or lines. How would you go about timing, like if someone can't read as fast or something like that?
So one thing that is encouraged in the disabled gamer community is allowing dialogue to be advanced at the user's discretion. So press A for the next line. If you're in a cutscene or whatnot, if you're able to pace it out, great. Otherwise, if you're completely reliant on following the timing of your cutscene, the BBC Subtitle Guidelines, that's available openly online. You can take a look at that. It gives ideas for pacing. If you need to shorten or abbreviate, it gives guidelines on how to do that. And the rate that you want subtitles to be on screen is try it out yourself, have it come up, and just read the words out, not at your usual reading speed, but like mouth it out. See if you can actually follow the pace of it being on screen. Okay. Yes? The question is, are there many disabled developers in the studio? I believe that all studios are, well, at least all studios that I've spoken to at different conferences are an all-inclusive business. In terms of staffing, people are onboarded. We don't discriminate. For example, in the case of the teams that we work with internally, we don't discriminate based on whether someone's colorblind or someone has a motor impairment or if someone is unable to read as fast. This is all opinions that we value internally.
It's not really about discrimination, but make developers more easier with working with those people who have a better look.
Yep. Absolutely. So yeah, having developers that have disabilities, that identify with a disability internally, makes it much more of an investment from their colleagues and having that firsthand feedback directly within the team. So absolutely. Yes.
Do you have any suggestions for spending for UI content and for subtitles using the imaginary readability? Do you have any recommendations for developing dyslexic readers?
Right. So the question is about UI and subtitle development to try to make it easier for dyslexic users. There is a open source dyslexic font that you can find online that makes it much easier by subtle changes in the letters for someone to read the text if they have dyslexia. But a couple of key guidelines is that in terms of your font, avoid serifs. So go sans serif if possible. Pace out your letters accordingly. Don't try to jumble it up. Having justified both edges actually makes it a little bit more difficult. Left justify is easier to read in blocks of text. There's a lot of valuable resources online that can assist you on dyslexic-friendly development. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you very much. At this point, I invite you to experience the different activities that we have in the Accessibility Awareness Lab. I have various members from my team that are there to support and answer your questions. I'll also be around if you have any additional questions you'd like to ask me. So thank you very much for listening.